All right. Well, let's jump right in. So let's start with what I would call a stark reality. And you'll see this as we go through the data. Only 4% of organizations have fully automated their core identity workflows. So if you do simple math, that means that 96% of us are operating with a fragmented, manual, and probably dangerously inefficient system. And this isn't a future problem, right? This is an identity automation crisis that's happening right now. Based on what we've learned from over 500 security and IT leaders, the way that we manage identity is fundamentally broken for a huge number of applications our businesses rely on nearly every single day. In today's session, we are going to expose a massive automation gap. You'll learn from the latest research exactly why this is happening, and more importantly, how to identify and close these critical gaps in your own IAM program. But before we do that, I just want to introduce myself, Matt Chiodi, Chief Strategy Officer at Cerby. I've been in cybersecurity as a practitioner for over 20 years. Before I joined Cerby, I was Chief Security Officer at Palo Alto Networks. And my claim to fame is that way back when the Cloud Security Alliance launched their Cloud Certificate of Security Knowledge, I was one of the first 100 in the world. So that means if you go on the Cloud Security Alliance's website somewhere and you dig through their old pages, you might just find me on that list. Also joining me is Aaron Turner. Aaron, tell us about yourself.
Hey, Matt, it's good to join you today. So, Aaron Turner, I'm a little bit older than Matt. I guess when it comes to CCSKs, my equivalent would be I think I had one of the first MCSE plus security ratings that Microsoft released back in the late 90s. But back in that day, I was part of the Microsoft team that was tasked with building a system that would displace Novell from the ecosystem. And so spent some time working on Active Directory and all of the technology offshoots, the security things like Trusted Platform Module, and did some work on Windows Update. And so spent 8 years at Microsoft doing interesting things. Then later, I've been an IANS faculty now for 20 years, trying to help people make good decisions.
I love that. And Aaron, I got to ask you, what is behind, is that a real background or is that actually a Volkswagen of some sort behind you?
So I'm joining you from my makerspace. This is a workshop that I've built where I restore old air-cooled Volkswagens. So this is the 1966 Volkswagen Combi, is what they call it. Some people would call it a van, but I've hopped this one up with a little bit overpowered engine. It's got a convertible roof on it now, so kind of some cool stuff that I've done to make it sort of a custom mod Volkswagen from the 60s.
You are a Renaissance man. And I've known you for many years, and every time that we meet, I learn something new. So that's pretty cool. We're gonna have to talk a little bit more about that. I didn't have a bug. I had a bug. I didn't have a bus back in the day. So, all right. Well, let's jump into the topic, right? Let's just start with a site that is familiar to everyone, what I call the consumer first login screen. So think about apps like ADP, which probably 70% of organizations use, Xylo, or even X's new AI, Grok. These applications were built for ease of use, not for enterprise identity integration. They often lack options for single sign-on, and when your marketing, HR, or finance teams need to use these types of business critical apps, they're often forced to create these accounts outside of your official identity provider. And this is just talking about SaaS apps. We know this challenge exists with on-prem apps, legacy apps, and I would call this just the very beginning of the identity automation gap. Aaron, I know that you've seen the application landscape evolve from on-prem to cloud, now to AI. Does this slide reflect the reality that you see day to day?
Well, in another past life, I was the CEO of a startup that was focused on selling stuff to enterprises. And if you think about someone who's trying to get an enterprise product to market, you know that the moment you try to do enterprise identity, you're going to get sucked up into all sorts of stuff. And so when you're even for SaaS applications that are being marketed to the enterprise, they're going to go this route. Log in with Google, log in with Facebook, log in with whatever social application login you can, because they know that's going to be less friction to attract users to their platform. And in today's age, where your valuation is dependent upon how quickly you can acquire users, that's why we're seeing this, right? Is essentially most startups perceive enterprise identity as friction to getting the deal done, not a facilitator.
The other thing I've seen is I've worked with now probably 150 plus customers and also IONS clients. I'm also on faculty at IONS like you are, is that they've got the new SaaS apps they're dealing with. A lot of times the assumption is that these new SaaS apps support all the standards. And I think we need to be clear, right? We're not talking about true enterprise grade platforms like a Microsoft 365 or Salesforce. They support SCIM, they support those single sign-on standards. We're talking about industry specific applications. We're talking about applications that are maybe newer to market, but it's a massive, massive category of these applications. And we did some research. We kind of hinted at this when we started, but we looked at the top 10,000 applications that are used in the enterprise. And we know 10,000 sounds like a lot, but we know there are tens of thousands of apps that are just in the ecosystem that are out there for the enterprise. We just looked at that kind of that top third, and these are some of the takeaways here, right? When we look at support for what would be required to do enterprise grade single sign-on, 54% of applications, they don't support SAML or OIDC. And if you have that app, that means that, well, you got to do username and passwords. But probably the statistic on here that I find probably the most staggering is around the 93% of apps that don't support SCIM. To me, that's huge, right? The SCIM standard, SCIM 2.0, was released in 2015. That means it's a decade old. It's not like it just was created and people are just learning about it. Aaron, for like the security and IT leaders that are in the audience that are listening, maybe explain in practical terms what the absence of SCIM means for them on a daily basis, especially when an employee joins, changes roles, or leaves the company.
So, when you've got a centrally managed identity platform like Active Directory or Okta or Entra ID or whatever, you control what goes on and off of that. But let's say that you do have another identity subsystem that's running some line of business application and it doesn't support SCIM. What that means is you're going to be near fully manual for enabling that identity, right? What are you going to do to basically make sure they're in the right role, that they don't have any sort of conflict of interest, or you've got appropriate separation of duties? When there's a leaver, or if they transfer, you've got to manually make the change inside of that role. You've got to manually make that change to make sure that they've been disabled appropriately. And so the absence of SCIM, and I will say again, having been the CEO of a startup, why would you want to support SCIM? Because you don't want people to automatically disable accounts. It could reduce your license count. And so there's sort of a conflict of interest here where these new age enterprise focused apps don't necessarily want to reduce their revenue through SCIM. So they make it so you have to manually, cancel someone to avoid paying the license for them.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's kind of, again, if I'm a startup or, maybe I've had my product in the market for a number of years, it's actually a pretty wise business decision to not support SCIM. And I think that's why this number is so high. Like when I first saw this, I was like, no way, come on. But there's a lot of what I would call enterprise class apps that are out there that maybe have partial SCIM support. Like I've noticed a lot have just for onboarding, but not like you said, but not the deep provisioning, not deep provisioning. So that's a huge piece to it. So let's talk about what the lack of protocol support creates, right? And I think there's really three major problems the way I can see it, right? We talked about the massive automation gap, right? Only 4% of organizations have managed to fully automate their core identity workflows. Simple math means that means 96% of us are stuck in manual mode. And disconnected apps, they just widen that risk. Every app that isn't connected to your identity provider is essentially an island, creating visibility gaps, security blind spots. And then as you mentioned, these apps, what it means is that there's manual execution. It becomes your default. When you can't automate, you're forced to rely on manual processes, which is slow, expensive, and oftentimes dangerously error prone. So when you hear a number like this, right, that 96% of companies are still running on manual identity processes. Does that surprise you, or is that just one of those dirty little secrets that enterprise security that people just don't really talk about?
If we look at the last 2 decades, everything that's within the walls of your enterprise and you have control over, great. But that's not how businesses run. I remember when we first started talking about the importance of using password generators and that sort of thing to help people solve for online identities inside of their browser. And we started to see the first enterprise internet password browsers, right? That you could plug in and go out and they would discover, oh, I'm entering a username and password. I'm going to capture that and log it. So this was probably 12, maybe even 15 years ago, those first started coming out. I remember speaking with a very large bank, one of the super duper banks in the United States. You'd consider them near sovereign. They found a massive password sharing problem because that big bank had to work with a lot of little banks. And those little banks did not have the ability to have enterprise grade usernames and passwords and identity. And so what ended up happening was there was one identity created for each community bank they had to work with. And let's say there's a team of 16 people that's coordinating wire transfers and commodities trades and all the stuff that needed to happen between those banks. Well, that one username and password had to be shared with 16 analysts at the bank. And so, and that's just the way it was because the little bank didn't have the maturity to create all the passwords that were needed for all those people. And so I think there is something deeply rooted in the real world way that identities are used that is always going to make this a reality. Like, I don't think we'll ever get to a point where it's 99%. There's always going to be a set of identities that are going to be outside of your control because of the lack of sophistication of the counterparty. That your business partner doesn't have the identity maturity to do this. And so you're going to be stuck doing this. And whether that's a SaaS app, a small community bank, it used to be that the federal government did this for you. Like back in the bad old days of federal procurement, you would have to share a username and password for all of your federal procurement stuff. And so talk about, going against the NIST standard, right? The government wasn't even walking its own walk. So I think there's always going to be a set of those business-focused processes that are going to have an anchor in the past of non-modern identity.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've seen that with so many different clients that I've worked with over the years where it seems to be like if I'm talking with a younger company, let's say a company that's been around a decade or less, they tend to think like this really isn't going to be a big problem for us. We're kind of this tech forward company. And then as we dig in to their apps that they're using, it's like you said, every company, whether you're a 5-person AI based startup or whether you're 50,000 people, you have third parties that you're dependent upon. Like, you're not truly an island. And that is really what I think makes this problem so persistent. And we've got a slide that talks about, really just quantifies what manual execution really means, right? We know it's a world of hidden risk, but when 59% of organizations are still manually provisioning and deprovisioning user accounts, that means, like you said, every time someone joins, moves, or leaves, it's a manual ticket and really a prayer that every account is updated correctly. So I know from speaking with, being in organizations where I've run the security program, we've had the large IGA platforms, right? The SailPoints, the Savients. And for those apps that don't support standards, what happens is like, if I need access to an app, I come to the request portal, I fill it out, I select it from the catalog. It'll go through an approval process, whatever workflows, it'll go to my manager, should I have access, whatever the approval workflows are. Once it gets to the final approval for a disconnected app, it just drops into a ticketing system, BMC, ServiceNow, whatever it is. And then you're at the mercy of the application owner. Could be a day, could be weeks, sometimes it's months. And just think about the reverse of that on the deprovisioning side. It's often the same way. So I'm curious, Aaron, from your perspective, with almost 60% of organizations admitting that they've got a fragmented approach, what does it feel like for a CISO trying to prove compliance or manage risk effectively? Like, what are some of the biggest blind spots created when identity execution is spread across different teams, manual processes?
Yeah. So first, let's look at the business driver that makes this a problem. So if you take a look at the modern business reality, there's a huge amount of M&A that takes place every year, right? Company A acquires company B, or company A divests company B, or whatever. So you're constantly seeing this mashup of companies. And every time one of those mashup events occurs, you've got a different identity system. And so in the modern age, where a CISO is in a relatively successful company, the likelihood that they're going through M&A activity is super high. And in that process, that means they've got very divergent identity platforms they're dealing with. And so there's always going to be a jump between the mothership and the newly acquired company or whatever. And so there's the business reality is the rhythm of business is driving identity diversity. Now, when it comes to where a CISO sees this is when they go, let's say that they're a regulated entity, publicly traded, or they're a critical infrastructure provider. In those cases, the CISO has to attest to the identities that are being passed through their system. And in that process, they've got to go through and say, well, how do I run a user attestation report? Well, I'm going to kludge all this stuff into an Excel spreadsheet and try to make it work so I can get this report done. And then they're doing that every quarter. And then they have 3 people managing spreadsheets that are doing it. And then you have the auditor comes in and says, well, actually, this spreadsheet was wrong because you didn't do it right. And so this is like a tar baby, right? You touch it, and you talk about it the wrong way, and all of a sudden your entire security program is now wrapped up into identity attestation, where you don't have the staff and you don't have the tools. And so I think the business reality is forcing these diverse identity platforms, and the technical reality is because of the lack of consistency and tooling, people have thrown people, Excel spreadsheets, sometimes even trying to create their own data lakes to try to make sense of this. And so that's the tail end you got to clean up, is you've got to explain how you're accounting for this. And oftentimes it's not a great look because you're not appropriately handling this diversity of identity.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. Like, businesses by their very nature are constantly moving, constantly changing systems. And as part of that, especially if the company has really any type of scale, like there's almost always some type of M&A. Like, especially when I talked, of course, you talk about the financial services sector, like it's kind of funny, you do your, 1 or 2 calls with them and usually ask like, hey, what does your identity infrastructure look like? And you usually get a laugh because they're like, we have it all. And you're like, well, what do you mean you have it all? I've got Okta from this acquisition. I've got Ping Federate from this one. I've got Active Directory, like original Active Directory. I've got Entra ID, and they literally go through every single tool. And it's no wonder why these statistics, especially in some of those more regulated industries, they don't really shock me. The 41% that still handle credential sharing and password rotation manually, everybody still has service accounts, right? Everybody has service accounts, and they've got to be handled manually. There's no way to automatically do that for many of these organizations, and they don't even know where these accounts are. And oftentimes they don't want to rotate those passwords because they're not sure what might break if they do.
Exactly.
So it sounds like there's, from your experience, there's a ton of blind spots that are created when identity execution is spread across different teams and manual processes.
Oh, and let's take a look at what just happened with the NPM incidents, right? With that code injection problem. What was the target of that last round? It was going out and looking for hard-coded identities that were laying in code, right? Hard-coded API keys, hard-coded, SSH keys, these sorts of things. And so I think the attackers have realized, because of the brittleness of some of those critical identities, meaning that we're hard-coding them into apps, we're hard-coding them into DevOps pipelines, that's where they're going. And that's the Salesloft into Salesforce situation too. Bad guys crack the Salesloft API keys, use those API keys to get into Salesforce, use the Salesforce access to get inside of Google Workspace, Microsoft 365. And so the brittleness of our identity capabilities and the identity ecosystem, it's causing the attackers to notice, and they are going after these things now.
Yeah, attackers they've always been opportunistic in terms of, hey, you would do the same thing if you were on the other side. You're going to look for the easiest, softest target. And what we've been kind of talking about this whole time is what we call disconnected applications, right? These apps are called different things. Gartner calls them non-standard applications. A lot of the more regulated industries, special financial services, call them disconnected. If we're talking just about the authentication side, you might hear the term non-federated applications. But really, these are applications that are business critical, that your identity infrastructure, again, like your SAML, your IAM, your IGA tools, that they can't govern, right? They lack support for SSO, SAML, SCIM, and oftentimes have no usable security APIs, which is why I think on one of the previous slides, I forget the exact percentage, but I think it was like somewhere in the 60% range of apps don't have MFA enabled. And it's because it's a manual process. There's no API to call. And so when we look at the world of disconnected apps, we see they generally fall into two buckets. What I call fully disconnected apps. That might mean that they've got no single sign-on support, no SCIM support, and they're truly an island, and there's really no way to get in there. And then you've got partially connected. Maybe they support single sign-on. We see this a lot with EMR, right, in the healthcare space, where they support single sign-on, but there's no support for SCIM, or it requires expensive licensing or some kind of crazy development to unlock that integration. And so you kind of have this bifurcated world of apps. You've got those that are connected, and then you've got the disconnected world that really falls into these different categories.
And to double down on the importance of those, you take a look at the criticality of those applications relative to your brand. Right? Mm-hmm. So like if someone gains access to Twitter, what can they do? Right? If someone gains access to Facebook or Instagram, what can they do relative to your brand? One of the most interesting cases I had with IONS was a major financial services player was trying to reduce the likelihood of someone breaking into their app store publishing channel. So their Apple ID that they were using to publish to the App Store was not federated back to the mothership. So they had no accountability of who was actually publishing stuff at the App Store. And so we had to think through how do you bring consistency to those core places, right? Which are super brand critical.
I love that you bring that up, because I know that before I got really deep into this space, I wouldn't have thought that much about those enterprise social media channels. Right. But, you know, in the aftermath of COVID, that's the primary place that consumers go to learn about a brand, or other businesses do. And I know for, you know, if you are in any type of specifically consumer facing industry, if you're part of the consumer products type of industries, your marketing teams, PR teams, they are sometimes spending tens of millions or hundreds of millions in advertising through those social channels. And those are tools that are completely not federated, right? So when someone leaves your company, they retain access. Maybe you've got third parties that are doing your paid social media. These are applications that you don't traditionally think of, but they have a massive impact on your brand. This happened to, think it was the SEC, was it 2 years and a half ago, where remember it was Gensler's post that came out saying that we approved the spot Bitcoin ETF, and they're like, actually we didn't. Account got taken over, and then a month later they actually did approve it. So who knows if that was just what that real purpose of that was. And then it happened to, I think it was CrowdStrike, sometime similar in the last year, where their account also was taken over. So you're right, these are, you know, it's not just the on-prem legacy apps, it's not just the SaaS tools, it's also enterprise use of social media that really falls into this space. Well, let's dig in a little bit more to the real cost of manual execution. And then we're going to get into a case study, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So 58% of teams told us that former employees have retained access to systems after leaving the organization. Like, let that sink in, 58%. So a majority of companies, this means the offboarding process is failing, leaving doors open, lingering access, compliance challenges, perhaps operational disruption. Like, this is a crazy statistic. I know, Aaron, like, I want to hear your take on this, because you've worked securing national critical infrastructure at Idaho National Lab. Like, how do you even begin to calculate the potential damage from just one privileged user, Snowden, there's an example, retaining access after they've left, especially if they're a disgruntled employee? Like, how do you even begin to calculate the potential damage there?
So if you look at critical infrastructure, the most likely way that someone retains access is when you are a process control engineer and need to have access to certain grid components to make sure things are working at 2 a.m., exceptions get made. Like, look, we know you need to have access to this, and so an exception gets made. Maybe it's a hard-coded VPN key that's installed on a system somewhere. Some trust relationship is built between your home network and a critical infrastructure network. And so it's done out of the desire for reliability and to make sure you can maintain the grid at 2 a.m. or whatever you need to do when you're at home. But in so doing, you've created this exception that oftentimes is not managed, right? That trust key, that VPN exception, that firewall exception isn't properly managed. And so it's a combination of they still have their creds, you've created a network exception to allow it through, and now you've got a situation where someone leaves the electrical utility, but they still technically have access to whatever they need to do to get into that system because of those exceptions that have been made. So there's an infrastructure-based exception process. Now, if we look at things like more run-of-the-mill knowledge worker stuff, I've worked for some pretty sophisticated companies over the last decade, and in a case where I was an employee, I left, it was a separation where, we basically agreed that I'd be leaving as part of a package and that sort of thing, but I still needed to maintain access to my health benefits and my payroll stubs to make sure that I could pay taxes and that sort of thing. And this organization did not have a way to do that without keeping me enabled in those systems with my old username and password from the enterprise days. And so, so sometimes we're forced into those corners where it was their regulatory requirement to make sure that Aaron had access to his health insurance coverage and, payroll stubs and that sort of thing. So as a result, I had to maintain that identity, even though I'm no longer an employee. But what I discovered I guess I wasn't being malicious about this. I was just saying, well, I wonder what other systems I could have. Oh, wait a second. I still have access to an Office 365 subscription where I can use Word Online and that sort of thing. And so I was actually adding to their licensing burden because they didn't properly remove me from that stuff. And so sometimes you think through this, like out of the regulatory requirement that they must have access to health benefits, they create these secondary follow-ons and say, well, did we remove Aaron from Office 365 licensing? Maybe not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, when I zoom out and I think about these challenges that we've been talking through, identity is something that is intensely personal, right? And we are going to have multiple identities as we move throughout our lives, different corporate identities. But specific to like the cost of manual execution is, as much as possible, it's important to try to automate all these apps that are in your environment. And it's usually really difficult to do that, again, because we talked about the lack of standards. Well, one interesting use case, I mentioned this here. So Monday.com, this is a customer of Cerby, and just to kind of walk you through it, right? This is, it's for me, you can talk about statistics, but it's not until you really kind of get into what does this look like for a real company that it really often connects for me. So let's make it real with this case study. So Monday.com, this is a company that I think we all know. They've experienced incredible hyper growth, growing from a startup just over a decade ago in 2014 to now a multi-product public company with over 3,300 employees. They hit over $1 billion in revenue, and they just have had a massive number of growth over the years. They're close to, I think, over 250,000 customers who are now using their platform. But like any high growth company, they have a really high employee turnover rate. I think it's somewhere around 40%. And so, depending on where you're listening, maybe you're in a company that's got 500 employees, so this sounds really big, or maybe you're working for a multinational and you're like, we've got, 400,000 people. Just when you look at some of these numbers in their case study, just multiply it by the size of your company just to get a sense of what the impact could be. And the thing I love about Monday is that they did an amazing job quantifying at the beginning of the project. And as you see, as we go through this at the end, and this is something that a lot of cyber teams, they don't do well. They don't do really good at quantification. So when they looked at their manual identity costs, 22,000 hours annually on manually identity lifecycle management. So that's equivalent basically of more than 10 full-time employees just clicking buttons. That's massive, right? And again, 3,300 employees, that's massive. And so if you're at a company that's got 100,000, just multiply that out. And then if we look at the, another 2,400 hours were spent on just manual evidence collection for compromise. All told, all their operational cost of this manual workflows was just under $2 million per year. That's a very tangible price of the identity automation gap. And I know, Aaron, you've worked at some really massive companies. Do these numbers surprise you? Do they sound accurate? Are they small?
This is very much in line. And the thing in that timeline you showed to start, this is a company, this is a modern company. They started in 2014, right? This
Yeah.
is not some super legacy conglomerate. I've worked with companies, in one case, one company that was founded in the 1830s, right? So they've been around literally for 2 centuries, right? They have 25,000 employees. The amount of stuff they have is significant, right? So I would
Mm.
say if this is happening to a relatively recently founded, modern focused organization, what's going to happen when you're working for a multi-decade, potentially multi-century conglomerate, right? The problem is just going to be worse.
Yeah, and I think from Monday's perspective, like you said, this is like an 11-year-old company essentially. They had hundreds of these disconnected applications that were causing these challenges. And again, this isn't their internal systems, right? They don't have any on-prem legacy. This is them relying on an ecosystem of vendors that maybe it's a state tax app in one location, maybe it's this vendor, that vendor. They just accumulate really for any business. So I always tell people, if they're especially if they're in a quote unquote high tech startup and they're like, yeah, we don't think we have this challenge. I usually send them down a couple different paths to look, and then they come back and they're like, ooh, I didn't either. It wasn't, maybe they weren't on the identity team. They weren't aware of it, but every company absolutely has this challenge. Um, from Monday's perspective, they broke down the before and after. So Monday, obviously a Cerby customer, for them, their challenges really kind of fell into two different categories. There was their identity lifecycle management, so primarily onboarding and offboarding. We mentioned they had a fairly high employee turnover rate. That's pretty common, especially as you're in high growth mode. But it was taking days to weeks for employees to be fully onboarded. So just picture this, you hire this great employee, you're excited to get them started, and they can't get access to the apps they need to do their work. And so you've got lost productivity. On the flip side, then you have when people leave, people are retaining access, and you're not really sure, do they still have access? What do they still have access to? So this is, we've been talking about this, but this is a really common problem at big companies, small companies, and really the larger the company, the longer you've been in existence, the really the bigger and more complex this problem grows.
And from those two bullet points, the unintended consequence of not being able to immediately onboard people drives password sharing. So let's say that you're a junior person that's just come on board, you're expected to do some task, you're leaning over your neighbor, hey, how do you get that done? Oh, you have to do it in this system. I don't have access to that system, but I have to do this thing. Okay, well, here's my username and password. You go and do it too, right? And so the unintended consequence of not being able to do onboarding and offboarding effectively is password sharing, because people are trying to get their job done. They're like, I don't want to get fired. I just started here. I want to get this job done. When it comes to a user experience situation, imagine it, what I find cool about you guys' platform is you actually have a story to say, look, we could take an uncontrolled, unmanaged app and bind it to a passwordless experience. Like, users love passwordless, right? You could actually make it so someone could log in for Windows Hello for Business using their finger on their laptop. They bind Entra ID to Cerby. They have an uncontrolled app. You're managing that last mile identity. You've now provided single sign-on, passwordless capability into that ecosystem, which makes users happy, right? It says, well, I don't have one more thing I have to remember here. So you're reducing the unintended consequence of password sharing and increasing the user's likelihood of enjoying what they're doing. That's a win-win there.
Yeah, you really nailed it there. It's only been in the last, I'd say, 2 years that I've heard anybody in cyber really even start talking about how cyber can help the user experience. And this has been really pushed by, I know, a lot of CIOs when they're dealing with their CISO counterpart. Like, hey, how, like, all these different passwords, it makes it horrible. Users, they don't want to manage passwords, but this is what Monday was dealing with, right? They had passwords stored in all different solutions. And when they're stored in different solutions, that means they're not following policy. It means they're persisting beyond policy. Users don't want to have to manage them. And with the Cerby platform, we, of course, automate all that for them. Monday is an Okta customer. Now their users, they don't have to manage those passwords. They can just access all those applications in their Okta portal, and the passwords are automatically rotated. And like you said, the users get a passwordless experience. So better UI, better UX for the end user, better compliance, full automation. It's a great way to look at that. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that my experience in cybersecurity, many different cyber teams really struggle with quantifying the return on investment of their tools. Monday was able to quantify that they saved over 4,200 hours on what was previously manual lifecycle management. So putting that in perspective, again, that's the equivalent of getting back 2 full-time employees. Just imagine, like, with your security team or your IT team, like, what else could you be working with if you had 2 extra people dedicated to high value projects, maybe AI or whatever else you want them focused on, instead of repetitive tasks like onboarding and offboarding. They recouped over $500,000 of costs, which would have been just manual costs. So this is essentially newly found budget for them. It's money that can be invested in other tools. Maybe it's hiring more engineers. It could be perhaps, I have a colleague who did this process themselves, and they actually gave back budget to other parts of the organization because their predecessor had come in and bought all these tools and they were overspending. And they were actually give a significant amount back to other parts of the organization. And just to put a final point on this is around the return on investment. This means that for every dollar that Monday invested in Cerby, they received almost 4 back in recoup gains and productivity. So this is an example of something that's not only just a security fix, but it's a powerful financial decision. Aaron, you and I have talked about this before, but as an advisor to CISOs, like, how important is it for security leaders to be able to talk about their initiatives in these financial terms, recoup costs, ROI, especially when they're trying to get budget or getting buy-in from other areas of the business?
Yeah, so when a CISO is sitting around the table with the chief financial officer and the head of product and the head of customer success and all these different folks, what ends up happening is that all of those other business leaders have very easily measured return on investment. Hey, we invested 600,000 in this initiative and we netted $6 million over 3 years. Here's how we did that. Now, part of it is the role of cybersecurity is oftentimes to stop the bad, and you can't really show that in ROI. You can't say, well, we intercepted 14,000 emails that could have been phishing emails and we saved X amount of time. That's a stretch, right? And while we've tried over the last 2 decades to build those kinds of stories, it doesn't ring the same as actual provable. And so these are great numbers here. Obviously, that you for every dollar you spend, almost 4x back that you're saving in operational overhead and in time wasted or frustration with users. The other times that I've seen this happen is when you go out and do this and you actually have that discipline to measure. And when you communicate that as a CISO to your peers, it up levels your respect among those peers. It's like, oh, wait a second, this person is speaking our language. Right? They're showing how they're investing and how it's giving back to the business. And so, having these kind of metrics is really important to up level yourself as a CISO in those senior leadership conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime that when you're a security leader or a security practitioner, anytime that you can align what you're doing with a business initiative, or if you can, I think, you and I were talking about this yesterday, that if you can find somebody that is an ally in the business that's outside your function, it just strengthens your hand. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about this in another slide, but I think anytime you can do that is it's really powerful. So you're probably wondering now, you're hearing about this and you're thinking, all right, like, how do I know if I have this problem? Well, there's some of you here that have probably lived in identity for a number of years and you're like, yeah, we have this problem. I want to do something about it. And maybe there's some of you who are just like, I didn't realize this was that much of a challenge. Maybe you don't live in the world of identity. We put together what we call our 5-question challenge, and it's really simple. Ask these questions of your team. If you answer yes to any of them, you have a disconnected app problem and likely an identity automation gap. I look across these 5 questions. Probably the one here that is most easy to dig into is just to look at your ticketing system in your organization. So question 4, does onboarding and deprovisioning rely on manual ticketing? This is one that probably is easier to surface than, say, trying to figure out every single app that you have that doesn't support SSO. It's much easier to go in a ticketing system, just say, hey, is there manual joiner, mover, and leaver workflows? Because you're going to see a ticket trail for these. Hopefully you have a ticket trail, but there will be cases where there isn't a ticket trail as well. So Aaron, as I guess as a final thought, like looking at these questions, what is like maybe one piece of advice that you'd give to our audience to help them get started on a problem that probably for some of us feels overwhelmingly large?
So going back to what you mentioned on the previous slide, you need to find an ally. Who is the one who also cares about identities? Oftentimes that's someone in procurement who's looking after licensing of third-party applications. Sometimes it's someone in compliance who doesn't feel like there's a good enough handle on e-discovery. Sometimes it's, so you have to go find someone else who's also suffering with this through another lens. You find that person and then you say, hey, how can we work together to drive this? So for example, in the case of like an e-discovery problem, let's say, for example, last quarter, the legal department got a discovery request through a court order, and they had to produce certain things, and they felt like they couldn't produce everything they needed to. Well, when that happens in a legal case, that means the other side generally wins by summary judgment. That's a good way to lose a lawsuit if you cannot produce what you should. And so you need to find those elements of pain outside of IT, whether that's e-discovery or compliance or licensing payments or whatever. Go look for the pain somewhere else and have them help you go along for the ride here.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. I mean, and some of this is just, kind of leadership 101 is building your alliances. I think for many years, security teams kind of did exist as the kind of the team that was off to the side. And as cybersecurity has moved to the forefront over the last, I'd say probably the last 5 to 10 years, it's becoming more important to be able to do this. So let's bring this full circle. The key takeaway is this: manual identity processes for disconnected apps. It's a huge unaddressed risk in most organization, but it is a solvable problem. And focusing on the last mile of identity, you can close the gap, reduce risk, and often save an incredible amount of time and money. So there's really a couple of takeaways. Right now, we'd love for you to download and read the identity automation gap report. If you scan the QR code on your screen, it'll take you to the report. We only covered a really small portion of some of the findings in the report. Otherwise, we probably would have been here for another 2 hours, and nobody wants that. So go ahead and download that now. Over the next 30 days, start the process of identifying other disconnected applications and accounts across your organization. And you really need to look far and wide: IT, OT, legacy, cloud. Don't just look in one place. If you're looking for a quick win, we touched on this a little bit earlier in the beginning of the conversation, you can reach out to your marketing team and just ask them, like, hey, how are we managing access to our corporate social media accounts? Typically, you're going to get a little bit of a sheepish look, like, yeah, we either manage it in spreadsheets or don't really know. Like, this is a great place to start. And it's something that, we're helping at Cerby well over 100 plus different customers solve in their organization, plus all kinds of other applications. So that's a way to get a quick win. And then as you discover those applications over the next 90 or so days, start adding those disconnected apps to your risk register. It's the best way to begin to start building that business case for an investment around a solution such as Cerby. And of course, we'd love for you to start a proof of concept or a proof of value with Cerby. So that takes us to the end of our presentation today. It looks like we've got a couple questions that have come in. Well, this is a question that I get a lot of times. Aaron, feel free to chime in on this as well. But it's like, what are some examples of business critical apps that don't fit easily into today's identity and access management infrastructure? So I think we mentioned some of these. We already talked about like social media. ADP, this is a one app that we mentioned previously, but there are literally thousands of these applications. We work with a very large food services company, and they have an application that 99% of the world will likely never use, but it runs all of their routes across the world. And this is an app that is completely disconnected. No single sign-on, no SCIM, right? So again, this isn't going to be a household name app, but we find this from time to time. A lot of times when we work with financial services customers, they refer to this as third-party SaaS. They'll say, hey, we're working with this other organization. We're using their app, and we can't control, like they have to put all this like citrus, they try to put like a citrus infrastructure in place. So somebody has to jump out through a proxy, but that's the only way they can control the access. So these applications, they literally exist across the spectrum. I don't know if Aaron, there's any that kind of pop into your head as well, but there are a lot of these apps.
As IANS faculty, I'm handling, sometimes as many as a dozen Ask the Expert calls a week about identity. This week, I had one with an organization that runs a bunch of amusement parks in the United States. And so they have 90% of their workforce turning over every 90 days because, who runs an amusement park? Right? They're teenagers, people who are going to college. These are people who are not necessarily there for building a career. And so they're in and out, within 90 days. And so in that situation, what we were talking about them with is that they had a bunch of disconnected apps. 90% of their workforce is churning. Man, the amount of time they were spending, that is significant. And so you see those situations where you're in high churn situations, you're in massive diversity situations. That's where something like this pays off, is it gives you that consistency so that you don't have to spend as much time chasing after it.
Another question that came in is, what does automating the last mile of identity look like in practice? So the best example I can think of, I'll give two specific examples. One is identity, a whole lifecycle management process. So today, again, if you have a disconnected app and you have some type of IGA platform, you'll have a portal set up. Someone will come, they'll request access to it. But again, if it's a disconnected app, it'll just drop into a ServiceNow queue. So an example of automating that last mile is not getting rid of your existing IGA tools, but hopefully bringing in a solution like Cerby that works with your existing IGA tools. It doesn't replace them. It simply extends what they do to those disconnected applications. So in that workflow there, if I'm a user requesting access to some new app, I come to the IGA portal, I put my information in, I select the app I want access to in the catalog, I click request, it goes through the approval process. When it gets to that last approval, automatically their access is granted. Cerby carries that out on that downstream, formerly disconnected application. And it's that same process in reverse. When it's Aaron's last day, that access expires at 11:59 p.m. When it flips over to midnight, automatically Cerby's picking up that upstream SCIM signal from your IGA or your IAM platform, and it's automatically carrying out that on those downstream systems, whether it's 1 or 1,000 systems. All right, there was one last question, and then we'll close things out. What quick wins can leaders achieve in the first 30 to 90 days after identifying disconnected apps? That's a tough one, simply because everybody's environment is so different. And Aaron, I know you do a ton of consulting, so you're really great with the it depends. But any thoughts on this in terms of what are maybe some of the wins that a leader could achieve in the first 90 days after they've identified some of their disconnected apps?
So going into the project, this is where it's going to be very important, where the security leader understands what are the buttons that need to be pushed in the organization. Is it cost containment because of budget cuts? Okay, I'm going to help save X amount of licensing revenue by eliminating this overspend on provisioned users. Or is it we're going through a huge acquisition situation where we're going to be acquiring a bunch of companies to grow the company. Okay, well then my metric in the next 90 days is going to be, hey, I reduce the amount of friction to onboard these users because I've automated this. So I think it really comes down, you need to find out what is the button to be pushed in the organization and tie your metric in the first 90 days to whatever that business success case is.
I love that. I love that. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, Aaron. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening. Again, please download the report. If you'd like to learn more, please visit us at cerby.com. Thank you so much.